Okay, we're now going to take a look at sculpting terrains and also painting them as we sculpt. So I'm going to start out with a base material that's going to be a landscape. Let's use a grass, and let's see how that's going to look. And then what I'm going to do is add a layer for the rocks that we're going to be painting on top of this. So I'm using Untitled Terrain to begin with. And what we can do is there's a couple of different options for sculpting. There are a few different layers available. There's a 2D layer and then there's a sculpted layer. So the 2D layer is going to be defined by the resolution that we have set here, which is 256 by 256. And what we can do is increase that resolution, and I just have a very basic fractal right now. I'm going to go ahead and edit the function, just make it a little more interesting. Let's go ahead and set it to, the Verone is always nice. That looks pretty good. We're going to go ahead and decrease the gain a little. And decrease roughness just a little. And I do have the wireframe turned on, and that way I can see the geometry, which is really helpful when you're sculpting. So when you're painting in the 2D layer, it is confined by, in this case, 512 by 512. So if we go to Paint, we can select the Raise option, and this is going to adjust just the 2D layer. Also, once you start adjusting this and painting, within the function you're going to get a new node called User Touch-Up, and that is going to be the layer that you are painting added to the top of the function and the altitude production. So we can go around and paint. Right now I have airbrush mode turned on. If we turn that off, we're going to get a really bad looking geometry. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that, Control Z. So airbrush is definitely the way to go for sculpting and changing the 2D layer. Turning off airbrush is more useful for when you are assigning a material or painting a material, and that way it applies very quickly. So right now what we're doing is just going up and down just that 2D layer, and it will not subdivide the terrain any further when you're on 2D. Another thing you can do is set 2D lock. So if you want to only manipulate the 2D layer, and now this is something you do without a 3D sculpted terrain. If you have a sculpted layer and you turn on the 2D lock, it will get rid of whatever you've sculpted on the 3D layer. So I'm going to turn that off for now. And we have that grass. I'm going to go ahead and add in a new layer, and I'm going to select to manually define the present. So what I want to do is paint that in rather than have it be controlled by anything else. And let's go ahead and I'm going to use my fractured rock, and I'm going to discard the alpha channel. So we can see the green for the grass, and there's nothing yet for the fractured rock, which should be gray. So to pull up additional options and customize brushes, we have an option down here to open the brush editor. We can click on that, and now we can see a bunch of different options for painting. First, let's take a look at just some 2D effects, and then we'll start going into the sculpting. When we go to the Environment tab, we can constrain our sculpting, or actually our just, in this case, raise 2D. We can do an altitude constraint, and what this is going to do is allow us to define a range that we want to sculpt in. So we can set the altitude, And it looks like it's not quite refreshing. Here we go. Now if we want, we could also set the fuzziness option, which is going to blend it. And we have a top and bottom. And it looks like most of the terrain is constrained to this lower area. So with that on, it basically creates a mask. And then I'm going to decrease the flow. We don't want it to go too quickly. And I do have paint material turned on. I'm going to undo that. Right here, we can turn off, and basically we can choose whether or not we're going to sculpt or paint the material. So I'm going to turn off paint material, and now we're just going to restrict the sculpting. So you can see it won't apply where it is masked. We can also use a slope constraint. So if we just want to paint on the slopes, or if we want the opposite and we only want the flat areas, and then we can adjust the fuzziness for that as well. So then we could paint or sculpt just on those sections there. Undo that. And I'm not quite sure what's going on there. Maybe the fuzziness is too high. And I'm just getting kind of a weird effect right there. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the slope. We also have the orientation constraint, so we can choose a preferred orientation, and then the tightness is going to be how much coverage we have. And then we can adjust the fuzziness on that as well, and then choose the orientation that we want to paint on. So we have a lot of different constraints that are available. And these are essentially the same things you'll find within the material editor in the environment tab. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off. We can go to general, and now we can customize things further. There are a bunch of different 3D options and then a couple of different 2D options. If I turn on the 2D only and lock it, we can see all of the different 2D effects. So we have a constant 2D effects, which is like pebbles and stuff. Plateaus, flatten, the undo brush, which will basically work as an eraser. And then we can smooth out the terrain, or we can set an altitude amount. The altitude amount's cool because we can use the eyedropper here and choose an altitude, as we can see here. And then now we have a constraint, and what's going to happen is when we paint, it should only go up to whatever altitude we just set. So I'm going to turn off airbrush, and we can see that it's taking everything below and raising it up to that altitude, and everything above is being lowered down to that altitude. So that's a cool brush you can use. And these are available too within here, but we can customize it further. We could smooth it. And then we could use the undo brush if we want. And it should remove that from the layer. It doesn't look like it is right now. Okay, so we also have plateaus, which is going to grab from wherever you're selecting and then sort of level it out. I'm going to go ahead and just back up here. And I only have so many undo options available. And at this point, I want to go back, but I did modify the graph. So what I'm going to do is copy the function and just close this out, and it's going to bring us back to that default terrain. And then I'll reopen the terrain editor, and then I'm going to paste that function. So now we have that Voronoi back, and we can continue what we were doing before. I did lose, actually it looks like the materials should still be on there, but the distribution is basically gone. If we go to paint, we can see that fractured rock all the way on there. So what I'm going to do is turn off airbrush, and I'm going to invert and increase the scale, increase the fall off, and then just remove it. And then we can paint it in afterwards. So I'll just reset that where it was before. And now we can move on. Now what else I'm going to do is go ahead and click OK, close out the editor. And this way, if I screw something up or go too far and I want to get back to this, I can just hit the X. And you will need to have, if we go to File and Options, under General Preferences, there's a Show OK and Cancel on floating dockable dialogues. So that way those show up, otherwise they won't. Now, there's another painting option next to the sculpt and the paint, and that is the freeze. So what this allows us to do is paint a mask. I'm going to turn off airbrush so we can just paint that in. Turn off wireframe for now. So if we want to restrict our sculpting to a specific area, we could even use the environment for this. Slope constraint, and then paint in the mask based on that. Turn it off, and now we can see that in there. So this will restrict any further sculpting to those areas. And you can see it stops once it hits that mask. I'm going to go ahead and just undo that. And then what we could do, if we want, we could invert the mask, or we could just clear it. Now let's take a look at 3D sculpting. I'm going to switch over to 3D Sculpt, the brush preset. And there's two primary ways to sculpt, whether you have auto picking or whether basically you have freeform on or off. And I'll show you what that does. So with freeform off, once you click the first time on the terrain, whatever angle and position that you see with the normal sticking out, that little line, it's going to lock it to that direction. So it'll continue to move in that same way. Now, if you turn on freeform, it's going to conform to the normal that you're painting on. I'm going to turn down the flow. And we can pull it out. So as you can see, that normal is changing along with the direction of the brush. So that's what freeform does. Limit bandwidth is for restricting the subdivisions. As you start painting with smaller brushes, it will continue to subdivide the terrain. So if I reduce the brush size and start to paint, you can see it just subdivided the terrain. So it adds geometry to make up for that smaller amount. There's a whole bunch of 3D options, smear, and let's see what else we have. We can inflate, we can pinch. So inflate, oh, that's way too much. size it up. Sometimes with some of these tools, you really have to decrease the flow. Right now I've got it to 0.01, but you can see it's inflating the different areas of the terrain, creating some cool overlaps. Also, what happened is now we're getting a polygon amount for the 3D geometry, which right now is 524,000 polygons, which is basically the same as 512 by 512 resolution terrain. So we can also pinch, and this one's going to require a higher flow. And we can just pull areas together and create some interesting effects that way. And move over here. We can also invert that. Some of these you don't really want to invert because they can be a little weird. Inflate is one that if you have it negative, it does bad things. Although that's because the flow is so high. But what's going to happen if you have it too high is you get this weird kind of effect. Another thing I want to note is that when you want to focus on a specific area, you hold down the Shift key and double click. And that's going to center it to the normal that you've clicked on. So if we want to work up here on this peak, we can move the brush up on top of it, hold down Shift, double click, and you can see that little red sphere moving. And that's our center point. That makes it a little easier to work with everything. Now, one of my favorite things about sculpting is the ability to use a mask. So in other words, we can use images to create custom brushes and get some really cool effects. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on the mask, and then it's going to pull up images, and this is the Terrain and Landscape Brush Kit from asileFX. There's a couple of different formats. You can use JPEG, or you can use the 16-bit Photoshop files. And I'm going to go to Square. Actually, let's take a look around and see what we got. And I'm actually going to use something from Peaks. I do like the way those look. And let's use Peak 13. Now one thing it's going to do is invert that image, so we do need to invert it back. And now, as it is, it's not going to subdivide anything. Oh, I do have it on inflate. So I'm going to go back to 3D Sculpt. And I'm not going to save the brush, but I'm going to turn the mask back on. And now we can paint with that. If we want, we can also turn on the material and select the fractured rock. And then it'll start to apply that to it. Now, we're not getting the detail from the brush that we need. And these are fairly large images, so we can get a lot of detail out of them. But we just don't have enough geometry. So what we can do is go over here to where the subdivide is, and we can subdivide up to a certain amount. So in this case, it's going to subdivide up to 1,000,000 or so. And let's see here. So the smaller the brush, the more subdivision we're going to get. And I'm going to decrease that flow a little. And now we can get some rocks coming out here. Just to fall off. Oh, that's still too much. And some of these can be finicky. But we can add detail this way. And you can see the material being added as well. And if you want to use a different material and you have multiple layers, you can just go ahead and select them here. And then another thing we can do is rotate it if we want. If we want to move it to a different direction, we could also tile it. And now it's going to show on the entire terrain. And as we rotate around, it's moving with the camera. If we turn off the fixed orientation, then it'll just apply that mask to the whole terrain. And turn that back on. Another thing we could do is set scale 0.2, and then it's going to start tiling across. I'm going to turn that off. So we're just getting some nice rocks in here, just to begin with. Click OK. And then it's going to apply that. And right now we've got 3 million polygons because it did subdivide quite a bit. And now I'm just waiting for it to process. So it looks like everything I painted is over here. And I'm getting some kind of sharp edges, which I might need to smooth out. Let's just take a look and do a quick render. And I don't think the materials are sized properly, but this should give us a good idea what it's going to look like. And this is just the final render quality. It does look like I want to increase that grass a little larger. Let's go ahead and increase that to 10. And we should have more of a distribution of that variance. So I'm going to go back into the terrain editor. And if we take a look at some of those problematic areas, we can easily see which parts of the terrain are going to need to be fixed. And usually you could just smooth this out. We can go to smooth down here. And let's adjust the flow and the size. And just kind of go through and try to get rid of the major stuff here. Now, if you take a look, based on the brush size, and when I start to paint, what's going to happen is, because of the brush size, what we're doing is we're actually smoothing out a different layer of geometry. Based on the brush size, it will affect different levels of the geometry and different subdivisions. So you can see right now, without a smaller brush, we're not going to be able to smooth that out. But I do want to affect a higher layer. So what we can do is go over to limit bandwidth, and then we can actually type in which layer we want to work on. So right now I've got it set to 7, which should be the highest subdivision at the moment. And that way we're just working on that, basically the fine details, and we don't have to remove the detail from the larger features of the terrain. So anywhere that's showing up to be too much of a problem, a lot of the weird jagged edges we're getting are caused by there not really being enough geometry, which we can take a look at right here. So if we needed to, we can smooth out those areas just a little, but still kind of get our peak that we have right there in that kind of sharper edge. So we could go through, clean that up. We can see right here, there's anywhere there's these huge gaps and separations in the geometry are going to look kind of bad in the render. So you can go through and just clean that up. So there's a lot you can do with the different sculpting masks and brushes as well. If we go back to 3D Sculpt, I'm not going to save my brush. Go to Mask, and I'm going to load in something different this time. And these are some of the erosion brushes I made. There's some cool features you can get from them. I'll go ahead and use Erode 3. And for this, I'm going to scale it up a bit. And we can increase and make sure it'll subdivide. And then if we also want to continue painting with that as well, we could turn that painted layer back on. Actually, in this case, I don't want to paint it. I just want to pull that out. So I'm getting some nice fine lines in here. And this was actually made, this brush was made in the terrain editor using an older version of Vue and using the effects tab. So I started out with the terrain, and then I eroded it, and then I ended up just using an export from it. I was able to create an interesting brush. I'm going to turn down the flow, increase the size. And it might not be subdividing enough. What we could do, let's turn on limit bandwidth, and let's set it to 7, and let's see if I can just affect that finer layer. But when you do that with a larger brush, it'll take a little longer to process sometimes. So this is doing kind of some interesting stuff to it. And then we could even go over to just the 2D layer and use a mask that way. So if you just want to paint on the 2D layer, which is the 512 by 512 up here at the top, but otherwise we have 5 million polygons. But you can create some really interesting landscapes by using different types of brushes. Now, one thing you may notice is if I move over to other parts of the terrain, the way they are subdivided is within that 512 by 512 pixel amount. And what that is doing is making everything look very pixelated. Sometimes this shows up in the render, and sometimes it doesn't. So if it is showing up, one thing you can do is, of course, smooth those areas out, but I mean, that's going to take a lot of work, and it might not be necessary. So first, let's take a look and see if it's even showing up in the render. A lot of times, the material itself takes care of the way that looks. We can see in the preview here, it's very pixelated looking where it is divided. A quick fix is to just convert it to a procedural terrain. Unfortunately, you can't convert it back to a height field once you do that because it will remove the 3D sculpted areas. So here is a close-up render of one of those areas that looked like it would have been really pixelated. But when we take a look, you really can't see it up in the render, or showing up in the render. So in that case, we wouldn't have to worry about it. But like I was saying before, sometimes I've seen it show up in a render where it's really quite obvious, and I found that if I convert it to a procedural terrain, which you can do up here at the top, go from a height field to a procedural, it will typically and usually correct that problem. But the biggest issue with that is you can't go back to a height field terrain once you've converted to a procedural, because any 3D layer on a procedural terrain will be removed once it's converted to a height field. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind. Also, one thing I want to note too with 3D sculpted terrains is when you save your scene, I highly suggest you select the compress scene option, which is available as a checkbox. And so I just go file to save, and just make sure you compress the file, because your file sizes are going to start getting kind of big, especially if you have multiple sculpted terrains in the scene. So it's usually easier just to cut down on those file sizes. And if you also decide you want to maybe bake the terrain to polygons, we can right-click, bake to polygon. That's going to take a really long time to bake, for one thing, but also it will increase the file size once it's baked. It will take up way more space than just the standard Vue object. 3D sculpting is also really useful for creating overhangs. And that's just something I want to cover really quick. One thing I want to note about when you create an overhang, the best way to really do it is to use an inverted brush and go in rather than pulling out and then trying to push the surface in. It does work out a lot better if you basically push it in rather than out. And I'm going to go ahead and load in a brush for this. I'm going to use one of my rock slab brushes. And actually, I do want to make sure that I am sculpting on the 3D layer. Oh, and got to make sure I invert the mask and then invert the brush. Not really sure why, but View likes to invert the images when you use the brush. Probably has something to do with the way it is trying to match the way it handles alphas, where those are backward as well. So I'm just going to increase the size, decrease the flow, and I don't have any subdivision on right now. So it's just going to pick whatever geometry layer is relative to the brush size. But if we want, let's go ahead and look for a different area here to kind of push in, and right over here. And once we start going in too, we can start getting the normals to kind of push off the side more, and that way when we select that area to start painting on, we can make sure we're going in. And once you kind of pull that, and what we can do is turn up subdivision, turn off the invert, and I'm going to start pulling it out up on top here. And this is going to be a little bits of extra rock added. And the rock slab ones can give some cool looks. Increase the flow a little. You can see we get some nice rock structures there. So there's a lot of cool things we can do with sculpting. I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And then we can see that new area added in. And we can also see those jagged lines. Now, those don't necessarily show up in the render either. And in this case, it looks like those problems are also showing in the render. So what we can always do is just go back, and then you can kind of clean things up. Because right here we have some very stretched areas. There's not really enough geometry in there. And just lightly smoothing it works pretty well.